Hi guys, welcome back to a new episode of the Black Janissary. Today I'd like to point out a new wargame created by Nicholas Edwards entitled The Suwalki Gap. It's a wargame featured in the last issue of the magazine Strategy and Tactics, precisely number 327, and it's about an area called Suwalki Gap that is located between Lithuania and Poland. And if the Russian forces would be able to close this gap, well, the three Baltic states, that is Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, well, couldn't be supported by the NATO forces, by the Western European countries. So it's a what-if scenario set in 2023, but it helps us also to understand better the complex strategical situation that we have nowadays along the Eastern Front. As usual, this is a typical example about a war game that can help us to understand and also to save lives, according to what a famous theorist like Philip Sabin always says. At first, before analyzing the mechanics and all the innovations that Nicholas Edwards uses to create better, to make this hypothetical conflict more real, let's analyze the components, starting from the mapboard that has been created by Joe Just, a fantastic artist, I think. Albeit I found a little weird the positions of the countries. Generally, I prefer having Poland on the left side and Estonia on the right side. On the contrary, it seems to me that the mapboard has been flipped. I don't know what the reason is, but I would have preferred having the Western Front on the left side. However, this doesn't have any problem in playing. I find the hues used in this mapboard very good. Also, the terrain symbols are very clear. You have the so-called urban areas that represent the large urban areas of the region. Then you have a very clear terrain chart printed directly on the mapboard. So the mapboard passes the exam in spite of these weird positions regarding the countries. So I place a mark of 6.5. What about the counters? Well, the counters not bad. The counters have been made by Nadir Farah. Well, it's important to remember that each counter represents a battle group, not a battalion, not a regiment, not a brigade. The battle group, please think of the famous German battle groups of the Second World War, and in this case we are not so far from that kind of battle group. And it's important to understand immediately that each counter has two modes. One maneuver side and the other one called dug in. Obviously, when a counter assumes a dug in side, a dug in mode, well, you have more positive modifiers on defense. So please remember these two modes regarding the counters, but it's important also to understand that beyond the combat units, you have the asset units. What do they represent? Actually, you have important units called anti-air. They are very, very important. You have the famous AS-400, the Russian AS-400 used to counter airstrikes, and in this case, each counter is not to be considered a combat unit, but on the contrary, each anti-air counter has a range and a movement. So you have a range and a movement. And please remember that if you are attacked, or better, if an anti-air unit is attacked, well, the value on defense is only 1. Then it's very important to remember that Nicholas Edwards, to portray the special forces, the paramilitary units, the insurgents that you can find in the area. Please think of the modern Ukraine. Well, you have these special units that affects directly the combats and also the maneuvers of the standard combat units. So these are characteristics that give to the game a typical example of modern war. Then what about the rules? Well, obviously, guys, as usual, I like a lot the rules booklet published by the Strategy and Tactics Press. Why? Because it is, as usual, well organized and well done. It's clear, and immediately you could also download the update booklet from the Strategy and Tactics Press site. Let's have a look at the booklet. Well, I want to show you in my main scene. If you notice, well, you have at the beginning the description about the counters. Then you find the setup, very, very, very appreciable. Immediately, it's important not to annoy the players and drive them towards an immediate setup, such way they could appreciate or less the game. Obviously, it's important to also to note the new mechanics or the new rules that Edwards has used to represent this hypothetical conflict. So the rules booklet is very good. It's made up of 16 pages, and you could learn it. You could learn it in no more than 1 hour and 30 minutes. So congrats to the authors of the manual. Let me see. I don't remember the proofers. Well, the proofers are Hans Korting and Michael Neubauer. So the booklet passes the exam, and I'd place a very good mark of 7.5. But the most important fact that the players have to notice is about I wouldn't say an innovative sequence of play, but you have to pay attention to the sequence. Why? Because beyond a traditional reinforcement phase, you have immediately at the point 3, 4, 5 a careful attention to the use of the air units. You find a simple phase called the NATO air base assignment phase, followed by a Russian air base assignment phase. Actually, you have also the two players have only to change the airfields if they need. Then, on the contrary, it's very important to understand well the joint air deployment phase. Pay attention. In this case, you have joint. Both players have to accomplish this phase. On the contrary, please notice that at the end of the air phase, you find Russian land honeymoon phase, and you don't have a Russian combat phase, but after the Russian movement, it's time of the NATO forces to move. It's a peculiar characteristic by considering this sequence of play, and obviously it affects the strategy of the players. And it's important also to, sorry guys, obviously the other phases are really simple. Combat phase in the following episode of the Black Janissary, we are going to deal with the combat phase, but it's very simple. You have a combat table, and you could use air support, or also the support of the ballistic missiles. Then Baltic Sea situation phase, very important. Why? Because at the beginning the control of the Baltic Sea is controlled by the Russian player, but if the NATO player is able to change the control, well, you could invade the Russian states by sea. And it's very important. Why? Because I think that I have to finish a complete game, but I think that the Russian forces could close the Suwalki gap in a short time, and the only possibility that the NATO forces have to counterattack is by sea. So it's very important to control the Baltic Sea. And then obviously the phase that closes the sequence is the victory check. I want to point out the naval rules, well, to let you understand better what I meant with the naval rules. Obviously, it's an abstract rule, and the wider naval situation on the Baltic Sea is simulated through an abstracted check to determine the side. So obviously you have to destroy all three Russian anti-ship units that are located in the region called Kaliningrad, and obviously there are no Russian units in Bornholm or Gotland axis. Let's consider this a peculiar situation on the mapboard. When I'm speaking of the region called Kalinin, let me see if I'm right about Kaliningrad, sorry. Well, I'm speaking of this area, and obviously the three coastal artilleries, or better, I don't remember the name of these counters. Let me see. Well, such way I could be a little more precise. Let me see. I'm going to take these, the coastal defense. Well, so you find three coastal defense units that can control the entire Baltic Sea. Then special rules, unconventional asset units. I would have already mentioned these unconventional asset units that are made up of paramilitary units. I repeat that they can affect in a range of 2 axes the combat table, or the fightings that are done by the combat units, the special forces that they special forces could destroy airfields and industrial installments, and it's I think that the most important rule that affects the entire sequence of play is the NATO intervention. Well, if you have a possible escalation by considering possible Russian actions, so you have to check not on the turn 1 but in the following turns if the NATO could intervene to support the Baltic state. And you could see in this picture the modifiers that in each check the NATO players has to include to intervene in support the 3 Baltic states. Victory, well, very, very simple. You can have a sudden death victory. The Russian side wins if all active NATO land units are encircled. Very, very easy. So please think of the situation. If the Russian forces close the gap and are able to control the Baltic Sea, well, the Russian player gets immediately a victory. And obviously, I think that the second case is a little remote. The NATO Russian players wins if all currently active enemy land units have been eliminated. Well, I have to finish a complete game to check this possibility. And obviously, on the contrary, if the game doesn't finish with a sudden death, with a sudden victory, well, you have to count at the end of the 3 weeks of fightings. I have forgotten to say that the game lasts 3 weeks or better 21 turns, so it's quite long, but I think that the first turns are not so long by considering the units that you have to move. Anyway, at the end of the game, you have to count the victory points that the 2 players have scored. And it's very clear, this victory point chart. I don't know, the Russian player could gain 12 victory points if a Russian land unit is present within the CTX. What does the Russian players have to do? Simply, he has to encircle the urban area in a NATO country. When I'm speaking of the NATO country, I'm referring to the 3 Baltic states. And for example, very important also, these 16 victory points, Kaliningrad city occupied by NATO units. Well, in this case, the NATO player could get 16 victory points. Obviously, you have to subtract these points from the total amount reached by the Russian players. Well, guys, what about the Russian deployment? It's very easy to do. You have to follow the instructions at the point 5.0 of the booklet setup. Please note you have, well, obviously, you have to place the markers about the Baltic Sea control, the turn markers. I repeat, it's a game that an entire game lasts 21 turns, and it's divided into 3 weeks, and obviously 7 turns are part of a single week. You have also to place the NATO intervenes marker on the NATO intervention track in the no NATO entry box. So at the beginning, you find the 3 Baltic states that are left alone to fight against the Russian military forces. And then you have also, and I find this rule very, very powerful at the beginning of the game. Why? Because only the Russian army could use the ballistic missiles, and you have nine chances to launch the ballistic missiles, and they are useful to destroy urban areas and airfields. So I suggest to use the ballistic missiles against the airfields and, above all, against the urban areas. Why? Because, I define that scorch earth before a possible NATO counterattack. What about the Russian setup? Well, at first you have to place the units, the Russian units in the area called Kaliningrad. Well, obviously we are speaking about the area in the Suwalki Gap. And then you have to place the Russian units and Belarusian units. Please remember, you are not obliged to place all the Russian forces available, but why not, guys? You have to place all the units in the top part, in the top edge of the mapboard, and you can attack immediately Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And I think that the main enemy at the beginning of the game is time. I think that the Russian forces should conquer the three Baltic states, or a large part of the territory in these Baltic states in short time, so not beyond 3 days. Otherwise, the Poland forces coming from the west and also the US units could stop the Russian advance. So please remember the speed of advance that the Russian forces have to keep. What about the NATO setup? Well, the NATO forces, the NATO player deploys after the Russian player, and you have to place the Polish units, but please remember, at the moment, or better, at the beginning of the game, the Polish units are not active. You have to wait for the NATO intervention marker that let the Polish player or the NATO player to activate the units. Then you place the small forces of the Baltic states, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, also Sweden, Denmark, and then you have the NATO units. Well, please remember, you have 2 battle groups in Lithuania, other 2 battle groups in the Latvia, and, well, let me see if I can move, well, and also 2 battle groups, 2 NATO battle groups in Estonia. Well, obviously, these 6 battle groups cannot resist they are outnumbered, so they cannot face a Russian offensive. If you notice, we have a lot of units coming from the north, and obviously I think that the major push is coming from this area, I repeat, to close the Suwalki Gap. Well, let's continue with our analysis. So the setup is very easy. At the beginning of the game, I played only 4 turns, or better, 3 turns and a half. And with the Russian forces, I was able to reach these this line. I don't know what is gonna happen after these free starting turns, and well, now I like to play with you an entire turn, and I want to postpone this playthrough in a following episode of the Black Janissary, also to check if you have had interest in this new wargame by Nicholas Edwards. So guys, back to the main scene. So guys, I hope to have interested you in this Suwalki gap, and I hope to see you soon. Bye guys, and have a wonderful week. Bye.